The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine grounds of Windsor Castle, as 10-year-old Prince George walked slowly toward the ceremonial gates. His small hands were clasped behind his back, a habit he had developed when deep in thought. The young prince had always been different from other children his age, not because of his royal status, but because of something far more personal and challenging. George had been born with a speech impediment that made verbal communication extremely difficult for him. While other children his age chattered endlessly about games and adventures, George often found himself trapped in silence, his thoughts rich and vibrant, but unable to find their way past his lips. The condition had puzzled doctors and speech therapists for years, leaving the royal family searching for answers and solutions. Despite intensive therapy sessions and the best medical care available, George's progress had been minimal. Each attempt to speak in public became a source of anxiety, not just for him but for his parents, Prince William and Catherine. They watched their eldest son struggle with frustration, seeing the intelligence and humor that sparkled in his eyes but remained locked away behind his inability to express himself freely. The castle staff had grown accustomed to George's quiet presence over the years. They had learned to read his gentle gestures, his expressive eyes, and the subtle ways he communicated without words. Many of them had developed a deep affection for the young prince, recognizing the strength it took for him to navigate a world that often demanded verbal interaction. On this particular morning, George had awakened with an unusual sense of purpose. Something felt different, though he couldn't quite understand what it was. His nanny had helped him dress in his formal attire, as there was to be a changing of the guard ceremony that afternoon. Typically, George would watch these events from a safe distance, avoiding any situation where he might be expected to speak or interact publicly. As he made his way through the castle corridors, George paused at a large window overlooking the courtyard where preparations for the ceremony were already underway. The guards moved with precision and dignity, their red uniforms bright against the gray stone of the ancient walls. He had always admired their discipline and dedication, though he had never found a way to express this appreciation. The young prince's tutor, Mrs. Henderson, had often spoken to him about the importance of finding one's own voice, even when words seemed impossible. She had encouraged him to think of communication as more than just speech, reminding him that some of history's most powerful messages had been delivered through actions rather than words. George pressed his small palm against the cool glass of the window, watching as one particular guard caught his attention. The man stood slightly apart from the others, and even from a distance George could sense something was troubling him. The guard's shoulders seemed heavy with burden, his usual proud posture slightly diminished. Throughout his young life, George had become exceptionally observant, perhaps because his inability to speak had heightened his other senses. He could often perceive emotions and situations that others might miss, reading the unspoken language of body movements and facial expressions with remarkable accuracy. The morning continued with George's usual routine of private lessons, but his mind kept returning to the troubled guard he had observed. During his history lesson, while learning about great leaders who had overcome personal challenges, George found himself thinking about courage and the different ways it could be displayed. His mother, Catherine, noticed his distraction during lunch. She gently placed her hand on his shoulder, offering him the warm, understanding smile that had always been his source of comfort. Without needing words, she communicated her love and support, reminding him that he was valued exactly as he was. As the afternoon approached and the time for the ceremony drew near, George felt an unprecedented stirring within himself. It was as if something was awakening, a quiet strength that had been building silently for years. He couldn't yet understand what was happening, but he sensed that this day would be different from all the others. The castle began to fill with visitors and dignitaries who had come to witness the formal ceremony. George could hear the distant sounds of preparation, the measured steps of the guards, and the low murmur of gathering crowds. Usually these sounds would fill him with anxiety about potential social interactions, but today they seemed to call to him with a strange sense of invitation. Standing in his room, looking out at the afternoon light filtering through the ancient windows, Prince George made a decision that would change everything. He would attend the ceremony not as a silent observer from the shadows, but as a participant in whatever was meant to unfold. Though he couldn't know it yet, his presence would soon demonstrate that true strength often speaks loudest in the moments when words are not needed. The grand courtyard of Windsor Castle buzzed with anticipation as guests began to gather for the changing of the guard ceremony. Prince George descended the stone steps slowly, his heart beating faster with each step closer to the crowd. His parents had been surprised when he expressed his desire to attend the ceremony up close, but they had learned to trust their son's instincts, even when they couldn't fully understand them. Catherine walked beside him, her presence offering silent reassurance. She had dressed carefully for the occasion, knowing that any public appearance with George required delicate balance between normalcy and protection. The media attention surrounding the young prince's speech challenges had been intense over the years, making every public moment feel magnified and scrutinized. As they approached the ceremonial area, George's attention was immediately drawn to the same guard he had noticed that morning. Now standing closer, he could see the man more clearly. The guard appeared to be in his mid-30s with kind eyes that seemed to carry deep sadness, despite his rigid professional posture. His name tag read Sergeant Matthews, and George noticed how his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his ceremonial sword. The crowd included foreign dignitaries, local officials, and members of the press who had come to document the formal proceedings. George felt the familiar weight of attention settling on him, the whispered conversations and sideways glances that always accompanied his public appearances. Some people stared with curiosity, others with pity, but he had learned to navigate these reactions with quiet dignity. The ceremony master began the proceedings with traditional announcements, his voice echoing across the courtyard with practiced authority. The guards moved into their positions with mechanical precision, each step choreographed through years of training and tradition. George watched intently, noting how each man carried himself with pride and purpose, representing something larger than themselves. Sergeant Matthews took his position at the front of the formation, but George could see that something was wrong. The man's face had grown pale, and despite his military training, small signs of distress were becoming apparent. His breathing seemed labored, and he appeared to be struggling to maintain his composure. The crowd remained unaware of the guard's condition, focused instead on the pageantry and formal aspects of the ceremony. Even George's parents and the other officials seemed not to notice the subtle signs that had caught the young prince's attention. Years of observing without speaking had given George an almost supernatural ability to read human emotion and recognize when someone was in genuine need. As the ceremony progressed through its traditional phases, George felt a growing sense of urgency. He could see that Sergeant Matthews was fighting some kind of internal battle, possibly a medical emergency or overwhelming emotional crisis. The guard's training kept him standing and moving through the motions, but George could sense that he was reaching a breaking point. The formal inspection began, with senior officers reviewing each guard's appearance and readiness. When they reached Sergeant Matthews, George held his breath, watching as the man summoned every ounce of his remaining strength to present himself properly. The inspection passed without incident, but George could see the enormous effort it had required. Catherine noticed her son's intense focus and followed his gaze to the struggling guard. Her maternal instincts, combined with her years of royal training and reading situations, helped her begin to understand what George was seeing. She glanced at her husband, William, who was engaged in conversation with visiting officials, unaware of the developing situation. The ceremony continued with speeches about duty, honor, and service to the crown. George listened to the words, but his attention remained fixed on Sergeant Matthews, who seemed to be growing more distressed with each passing moment. The young prince felt a familiar frustration building within him, the agonizing feeling of having something important to communicate, but lacking the ability to voice it. As the formal presentations concluded and the crowd began to shift for the final phase of the ceremony, George made a decision that surprised even himself. Despite his lifelong struggle with public speaking and his intense anxiety about being the center of attention, he stepped forward from his protected position beside his mother. The movement was subtle but deliberate, bringing him closer to the formation of guards and particularly to Sergeant Matthews. Catherine felt her heart skip as she realized what her son was doing. Torn between protective instincts and respect for his apparent determination to act on whatever he was sensing. George's small figure moving through the crowd caught the attention of several nearby guests, who began to whisper and point. The press photographers immediately turned their cameras toward him, sensing that something unexpected was happening. The young prince felt the familiar wave of anxiety that accompanied public attention, but something stronger was driving him forward. Sergeant Matthews, despite his distress, noticed the small figure approaching. For a moment, their eyes met across the formal distance that protocol demanded between royalty and military personnel. In that brief connection, George saw something that confirmed his instincts, a desperate plea for help that the guard's training would never allow him to voice aloud. The ceremony master continued with the proceedings, unaware that a small drama of human connection was beginning to unfold within the larger pageantry. George stopped just at the edge of appropriate distance, close enough to matter but not so close as to disrupt the formal proceedings. He stood perfectly still, his young face serious and focused as if he was preparing for the most important moment of his life. Standing at the edge of the ceremonial formation, Prince George felt a clarity unlike anything he had experienced before. The usual chaos of thoughts and frustrated attempts at communication seemed to quiet, replaced by a focused understanding of what needed to happen. Sergeant Matthews was struggling with something far beyond the young prince's ability to fully comprehend, but George knew with absolute certainty that the man needed help. The guard's condition was deteriorating rapidly, though he continued to maintain his military bearing through sheer force of will. George could see subtle tremors running through the man's body, the slight sway that suggested he might collapse at any moment, and most telling of all, the desperate look in his eyes that spoke of someone hanging on by the thinnest of threads. Catherine had moved closer to her son, ready to intervene if necessary, but something in George's demeanor made her pause. She had never seen him display such focused determination, such clear purpose in a public setting. Years of watching him struggle with communication had taught her to recognize when he was truly committed to something, and this moment felt different from anything that had come before. The crowd around them remained largely unaware of the unfolding drama. Dignitaries continued their conversations. Photographers captured standard ceremonial shots, and officials proceeded through their scripted roles. Only a few observant individuals had noticed the young prince's unusual positioning and the intense focus of his attention on one particular guard. George began to understand that his usual approach to communication would not work in this situation. Sergeant Matthews was too far away for whispered words, even if George could manage them, and the formal nature of the ceremony made any dramatic gesture inappropriate. Yet the urgency of the situation demanded action, and George felt the weight of being perhaps the only person who truly recognized what was happening. In that moment of clarity, George remembered something his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, had once told him during one of their private conversations. She had spoken about leadership not as speaking loudly or commanding attention, but as understanding when and how to act with quiet authority. She had said that sometimes the most powerful communication happened not through words but through presence and intention. Drawing on reserves of courage he didn't know he possessed, George began to move with deliberate purpose. He straightened his small shoulders, lifted his chin with dignity that seemed far beyond his years, and took several measured steps that brought him to a position directly in line with Sergeant Matthews. The movement was subtle but unmistakable, a clear statement of attention and concern. The guard noticed the young prince's positioning and felt a shock of recognition that cut through his distress. In George's steady gaze, he saw not pity or curiosity, but genuine understanding and support. For the first time in what felt like hours, Sergeant Matthews felt less alone with whatever burden he was carrying. George maintained eye contact with the struggling guard, communicating through expression and presence what he could not voice aloud. His face conveyed respect, concern, and most importantly, a recognition of the guard's humanity beyond his ceremonial role. The young prince had learned through his own struggles that sometimes being truly seen and acknowledged could provide strength when nothing else seemed possible. The ceremony master called for the next phase of the proceedings, which would require the guards to perform a series of precise movements and formations. George watched as Sergeant Matthews prepared to participate, clearly summoning every ounce of remaining strength to fulfill his duties despite his deteriorating condition. As the guards began their coordinated movements, George made another decision that surprised everyone around him. Instead of stepping back to a safe observation distance as protocol would suggest, he moved to mirror the guards' posture, standing at attention with the same dignity and respect they displayed. His small figure created a powerful visual statement of solidarity and recognition. Catherine gasped quietly as she realized what her son was doing. He was not disrupting the ceremony or calling attention to himself in any inappropriate way. Instead, He was using his presence to honor and support the guards, particularly the one who was struggling. It was a gesture of leadership and compassion that spoke volumes without requiring a single word. Several members of the crowd began to notice George's behavior, and whispers started to spread about the young prince's unusual participation in the ceremony. Some interpreted it as a breach of protocol, while others recognized it as something far more significant. The press photographers began to focus their cameras on George, sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Sergeant Matthews felt the power of George's gesture immediately. The young prince's recognition and support seemed to provide him with renewed strength, a reminder that his service was valued and his struggle was acknowledged. For the first time since the ceremony began, the guard felt capable of completing his duties without collapsing. The other guards began to notice their colleagues' improved condition and George's supportive presence. A subtle shift in energy moved through their formation, as if the young prince's quiet strength was somehow infectious. They stood a little straighter, moved with renewed purpose, and performed their duties with enhanced pride. George continued to maintain his position, his young face serious and focused, never wavering in his support despite the growing attention from the crowd. He had found a way to communicate what mattered most, using presence and intention to bridge the gap that words had never been able to cross. In supporting Sergeant Matthews, he was also discovering his own voice in a way he had never imagined possible. The atmosphere in the courtyard began to shift as more people became aware of the extraordinary scene unfolding before them. Prince George remained steadfast in his position, his unwavering support for Sergeant Matthews creating ripples of awareness throughout the gathered crowd. What had started as a routine ceremonial event was transforming into something far more meaningful and profound. Sergeant Matthews found himself drawing strength from the young prince's presence in ways he couldn't fully understand. Throughout his military career, he had learned to compartmentalize personal struggles and maintain professional composure regardless of circumstances. But today had been different. He had received devastating news just hours before the ceremony. News that had shaken him to his core and left him questioning everything he thought he knew about his life. The letter had arrived that morning, delivered by military courier, with the kind of formal efficiency that masked its devastating contents. His younger brother, also serving in the military but stationed overseas, had been seriously injured in an accident. The medical reports were uncertain, the prognosis unclear, and Sergeant Matthews had been left to process this information while preparing for his ceremonial duties. Military protocol demanded that he fulfill his obligations regardless of personal circumstances, and Matthews had always prided himself on his ability to separate duty from emotion. But as the ceremony progressed, the weight of worry and helplessness had begun to overwhelm his trained composure. He had found himself struggling not just with the physical demands of the ceremony, but with the enormous effort required to contain his emotional turmoil. George seemed to sense the depth of the guard's struggle without needing to understand its specific details. The young prince had lived his entire life navigating situations where he felt powerless to communicate what mattered most, and he recognized the signs of someone fighting a similar battle with different circumstances. The connection between them transcended their vastly different positions and backgrounds. As the ceremony continued, George began to notice other details about Sergeant Matthews that revealed the man's character beyond his current distress. The way he unconsciously checked on the younger guards in his formation, ensuring they maintained proper position despite his own struggles. The gentle nod he gave to a nervous-looking new recruit who seemed overwhelmed by the formal proceedings. The careful attention he paid to every detail of his uniform and equipment, maintaining standards even while fighting personal battles. These observations deepened George's respect for the guard and strengthened his determination to offer whatever support he could provide. The young prince understood instinctively that Sergeant Matthews was someone who dedicated himself to serving others, even when facing his own difficulties. This recognition created a bond of mutual respect that neither had expected to find. The crowd's attention was now fully focused on the interaction between the young prince and the struggling guard. Whispered conversations spread throughout the gathering as people tried to understand what they were witnessing. Some of the older veterans in attendance began to recognize the significance of George's gesture, understanding it as a profound display of honor and solidarity. Catherine watched her son with a mixture of pride and amazement. She had spent years advocating for George, protecting him from situations that might highlight his communication challenges and helping him navigate a world that often demanded verbal interaction. To see him step forward so deliberately, communicating with such clarity through presence and intention, filled her with overwhelming emotion. William, who had been engaged in diplomatic conversations with visiting officials, gradually became aware of the situation developing around his son. As he turned to observe George's behavior, he felt a deep recognition of leadership qualities that had nothing to do with royal training or formal instruction. His son was demonstrating an instinctive understanding of service and compassion that could not be taught. The ceremony master, initially concerned about the deviation from standard protocol, began to realize that something extraordinary was happening. Years of managing formal events had taught him to distinguish between disruption and meaningful moments, and George's participation clearly fell into the latter category. He made subtle adjustments to the proceedings, allowing space for the connection between prince and guard to continue. Sergeant Matthews felt his emotional barriers beginning to soften under the steady support of George's presence. The young prince's unwavering attention and respect were providing him with something he hadn't realized he needed, a reminder that his struggles were witnessed and acknowledged. For the first time since receiving the devastating news about his brother, Matthews felt less isolated with his worry and fear. The other guards in the formation had also become aware of their colleagues' distress and the young prince's supportive response. Without breaking formation or compromising their own duties, they began to subtly adjust their positions to offer additional support to Matthews. It was a demonstration of military brotherhood enhanced by the example George was setting. As the formal speeches concluded and the ceremony moved toward its final phases, George made yet another decision that would surprise everyone present. He stepped forward one more time, moving closer to Sergeant Matthews than protocol would typically allow, and performed a gesture that would be remembered long after the ceremony ended. The young prince, who had never been able to find his voice through traditional means, slowly and deliberately brought his small hand to his heart, then extended it toward Sergeant Matthews in a gesture of respect and recognition. It was a movement that communicated more clearly than any words could have, acknowledging the guard's service, his struggle, and his inherent worth as a human being deserving of support and understanding. The gesture that Prince George made, bringing his hand from his heart toward Sergeant Matthews, created a moment of absolute stillness in the courtyard. Even the whispered conversations ceased as everyone present recognized they were witnessing something profound and unrehearsable. The young prince's movement had been slow, deliberate, and filled with such genuine respect that it transcended the boundaries of protocol and ceremony. Sergeant Matthews felt the impact of George's gesture like a physical force. In his military career, he had received commendations, medals, and formal recognition for his service, but nothing had ever touched him as deeply as this simple acknowledgement from a 10-year-old boy who understood struggle in his own way. The guard felt his carefully maintained emotional barriers finally give way, not in weakness but in recognition of shared humanity. For the first time since receiving the terrible news about his brother, Matthews allowed himself to feel the full weight of his emotions without shame. George's presence and gesture had somehow given him permission to be human, to acknowledge his fear and worry, while still maintaining his dignity and purpose. Tears began to form in the corners of his eyes, though he continued to stand at attention with military bearing. George saw the guard's emotional response and felt a surge of connection unlike anything he had ever experienced. Throughout his young life, he had been the recipient of sympathy, understanding, and support from others who recognized his communication challenges. To be able to offer that same kind of meaningful support to someone else filled him with a sense of purpose he had never known was possible. The crowd watched in fascination as the interaction between prince and guard continued to unfold. Many of the observers were beginning to understand that they were witnessing a masterclass in leadership and compassion, delivered not through speeches or formal declarations, but through authentic human connection. George was demonstrating that true communication often had nothing to do with words and everything to do with genuine care and recognition. Catherine found herself struggling to contain her own emotions as she watched her son's extraordinary display of empathy and strength. She had spent countless hours working with speech therapists, trying various treatments and approaches to help George find his voice. Now she was seeing him communicate with perfect clarity, using a language of presence and gesture that was perhaps more powerful than any words could have been. The ceremony master made the decision to adjust the concluding proceedings to honor what was happening between George and Sergeant Matthews. Instead of rushing through the final formalities, he allowed additional time for the moment to continue naturally. His years of experience had taught him to recognize when spontaneous human moments were more important than rigid adherence to schedule. As the ceremony entered its final phase, something unexpected began to happen. George, who had spent his entire life struggling to find his voice in traditional ways, felt something shifting within him. The connection he had established with Sergeant Matthews, the sense of purpose he felt in offering support, and the realization that he could communicate meaningfully through presence and action seemed to unlock something that had been waiting inside him. The young prince took a deep breath, feeling a calm certainty settle over him. For the first time in his life, the prospect of speaking aloud did not fill him with anxiety or fear. Instead, he felt grounded in the moment, connected to his purpose and confident in his ability to express what truly mattered. The irony was not lost on him that finding his voice had required first learning to communicate without words. Sergeant Matthews, still standing at attention but now openly emotional, noticed a change in George's demeanor. The young prince seemed to be gathering himself for something significant, and the guard found himself holding his breath in anticipation. The connection they had established made him feel deeply invested in whatever George was preparing to do. The crowd sensed the building tension and expectation, though few could have predicted what was about to happen. George had captured everyone's attention through his extraordinary demonstration of empathy and leadership, and now there was a palpable sense that something even more remarkable was about to unfold. George looked directly at Sergeant Matthews, maintaining the eye contact that had been the foundation of their connection throughout the ceremony. He could see the gratitude and respect in the guard's eyes, along with something else that took him a moment to recognize. It was hope. The guard was looking at him with hope, not just for himself but for what George might be capable of achieving. Drawing on the strength he had discovered through supporting someone else, George made a decision that would change his life forever. He opened his mouth, took another deep breath, and prepared to speak aloud for the first time in a meaningful public setting. The words he had been unable to access for so many years suddenly seemed within reach, not because his medical condition had magically disappeared, but because he had found something worth overcoming it for. The courtyard fell completely silent as everyone present sensed that Prince George was about to attempt something extraordinary. Even the photographers stopped clicking their cameras, recognizing that they might be about to witness a moment that would be remembered in history. George felt the weight of attention, but instead of the usual anxiety, he experienced it as support and encouragement. With Sergeant Matthews as his anchor and the lesson of speechless communication giving him confidence, George prepared to find his voice in the most public and challenging circumstances he had ever faced. The young prince who had spent his life in silence was about to discover that sometimes the most powerful words come only after learning to speak through presence, action, and genuine human connection. In the profound silence that had settled over Windsor Castle's courtyard, Prince George felt a moment of absolute clarity. The usual jumble of frustrated thoughts and blocked words seemed to organize themselves into something clear and purposeful. Looking directly at Sergeant Matthews, George opened his mouth and spoke his first public words with a voice that, while quiet, carried across the courtyard with surprising strength. "Thank you for your service," George said, each word deliberate and clear. "You are not alone." The impact of those simple words was immediate and profound. Sergeant Matthews, who had been fighting to maintain his composure throughout the ceremony, felt the last of his emotional barriers dissolve, not in weakness but in recognition of the extraordinary courage it had taken for the young prince to speak those words. The guard understood instinctively that George had just overcome his own significant challenge in order to offer support and connection. The crowd stood in stunned silence for several heartbeats before the full significance of what they had witnessed began to register. Many of the observers were aware of Prince George's speech difficulties, making his clear, purposeful statement all the more remarkable. The young prince had not only found his voice, but had chosen to use it in service of recognizing and supporting someone else. Catherine felt tears streaming down her face as she watched her son's breakthrough moment. Years of worry, therapy sessions, and protective instincts had not prepared her for the overwhelming pride and joy of seeing George communicate so powerfully. But more than his ability to speak, she was moved by the wisdom and compassion he had displayed in choosing when and how to use his newfound voice. Sergeant Matthews, still maintaining his military posture, managed to respond with a voice thick with emotion. "Your Royal Highness," he said, "your words mean more than you know. Thank you for seeing me." The exchange between them had transcended their different ranks and positions, creating a moment of pure human connection that touched everyone present. The other guards in the formation were visibly moved by what they had witnessed. Several of them had worked with Sergeant Matthews for years and had never seen him struggle as he had today. To watch their colleague receive such meaningful support from the young prince, and to witness George's extraordinary breakthrough, filled them with a renewed sense of purpose and pride in their service. George felt a surge of confidence and clarity, unlike anything he had ever experienced. The words had come naturally, without the usual struggle and frustration that had characterized his attempts at speech throughout his childhood. More importantly, he had discovered that his voice was most powerful when used to support and connect with others, rather than simply to express his own needs or thoughts. The ceremony master, recognizing the historic nature of the moment, made the decision to conclude the formal proceedings with acknowledgement of what had just occurred. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "we have witnessed something extraordinary today. The true spirit of service and recognition of our shared humanity." His words helped the gathered crowd understand that they had been part of something that would be remembered long beyond the day's events. As the formal ceremony concluded, something unprecedented happened. Instead of dispersing immediately as protocol would typically dictate, the crowd began to spontaneously applaud. The ovation started quietly but grew in intensity as more people joined in recognition of what Prince George and Sergeant Matthews had shared. It was not the polite, formal applause typical of royal events, but genuine appreciation for an authentic human moment. George remained standing near Sergeant Matthews, both of them acknowledging the applause with dignity while maintaining their connection to each other. The young prince had discovered that his greatest strength lay not in overcoming his speech challenges, but in learning when and how to use his voice in service of others. The guard had found that sharing his burden, even silently, had made it more bearable. William approached his son with obvious pride and amazement, placing a gentle hand on George's shoulder. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly, understanding that his son had just demonstrated leadership qualities that could not be taught or scripted. George had found his own path to meaningful communication and had used it to make a real difference in someone's life. As the crowd began to disperse, several of the visiting dignitaries approached to personally thank Prince George for what they had witnessed. Many of them had children of their own and were deeply moved by the young prince's demonstration of courage and compassion. His breakthrough had inspired them to think differently about communication, leadership, and the power of genuine human connection. The press photographers had captured the entire sequence of events, but many of them found themselves more moved by the experience than focused on the professional opportunity it represented. They had witnessed something rare and authentic, a moment of real leadership and breakthrough that transcended typical royal news stories. Sergeant Matthews lingered as the formal proceedings concluded, clearly wanting to express his gratitude more fully to Prince George. The guard understood that the young prince's gesture and words had given him strength to face whatever challenges lay ahead with his brother's situation. More than that, George had reminded him that service and struggle were shared human experiences that connected people across all boundaries. As George prepared to return to the castle with his family, he felt fundamentally changed by the day's events. He had not only found his voice but had discovered his purpose in using it. The young prince, who had spent his life feeling limited by his inability to communicate traditionally, had learned that the most meaningful communication often came from genuine care, recognition, and the courage to reach out to others in their moments of need. 3 days after the ceremony, Sergeant Matthews stood in the office of his commanding officer, holding a formal letter of resignation. The events at Windsor Castle had changed something fundamental within him, though not in the way anyone might have expected. Prince George's extraordinary gesture and words had not only provided him with strength during his personal crisis, but had also awakened a deeper understanding of what service truly meant. The news about his brother had indeed been serious, but subsequent medical updates had brought more hopeful prognoses. While recovery would be long and challenging, the immediate crisis had passed. However, the experience of feeling so isolated with his fear and worry, followed by the profound connection he had shared with Prince George, had made Matthews realize that his true calling lay elsewhere. During those 3 days of reflection, Matthews had come to understand that his years of military service had prepared him for something beyond ceremonial duties and traditional military roles. The young prince's ability to recognize struggle and offer meaningful support had inspired Matthews to pursue a career where he could provide similar assistance to others facing difficult challenges. His commanding officer reviewed the resignation letter with surprise and concern. Sergeant Matthews had been an exemplary soldier with a spotless record and clear potential for advancement. "This seems sudden, Matthews," the officer said. "Is this related to the family situation you're dealing with?" Matthews considered his response carefully. "Sir, it's related to something I learned about myself during recent events. Prince George showed me something about true service that I need to pursue. I want to become a counselor for military families dealing with crisis situations. I want to help people the way that young Prince helped me." The explanation surprised his commanding officer, who had heard reports about the extraordinary interaction between Matthews and Prince George during the ceremony. The story had spread throughout military circles, with many recognizing it as a remarkable display of leadership and compassion from such a young member of the royal family. "The prince made quite an impression," the officer acknowledged. "But are you certain this is the right decision? You have a distinguished career ahead of you here." Matthews nodded with certainty. "Sir, I've never been more sure of anything. That young boy who struggles with his own challenges stepped forward to support me when I needed it most. He showed me that real service isn't about ceremony or tradition. It's about recognizing when someone needs help and having the courage to provide it. I want to do that for others." Meanwhile, back at Windsor Castle, Prince George was experiencing his own transformation. The breakthrough he had achieved during the ceremony had opened new possibilities for communication that he was exploring with growing confidence. His speech remained challenging, but the fear and anxiety that had once surrounded speaking had largely disappeared, replaced by a clear understanding of when and how his voice could make a difference. His parents had arranged for him to meet with his speech therapist to discuss the remarkable progress he had shown. Dr. Sarah Chen had worked with George for several years and was amazed by the change in his approach to communication. "What happened during that ceremony seems to have unlocked something very significant," she observed. "How do you feel about speaking now?" George considered the question thoughtfully before responding. "It's still hard sometimes," he said, his words coming more easily than they ever had before. "But I understand now that talking isn't just about me. When I spoke to Sergeant Matthews, it wasn't scary because I was trying to help him. I think I was scared before because I was only thinking about how hard it was for me." Dr. Chen recognized the profound insight in George's observation. "You've discovered something that many adults never learn," she told him. "Communication becomes much more natural when it's focused on connecting with others rather than on our own fears and limitations." The story of what had happened between Prince George and Sergeant Matthews began to spread beyond the immediate circle of witnesses. News outlets picked up the story, but rather than focusing on the spectacle, many journalists recognized the deeper significance of what had occurred. The young prince's demonstration of leadership and compassion, combined with his personal breakthrough, inspired conversations about different forms of strength and communication. Catherine and William watched their son's continued development with amazement and pride. George had not only overcome a significant personal challenge, but had done so in service of helping someone else. The experience had given him a new confidence and sense of purpose that extended far beyond his improved ability to speak. A week after submitting his resignation, Sergeant Matthews received an unexpected invitation to return to Windsor Castle. Prince George had requested the opportunity to speak with him again, and the royal family had arranged for a private meeting. When Matthews arrived, he found George waiting in the same courtyard where their connection had first been established. "I heard you decided to help other people," George said, his speech still careful but clear and confident. "I wanted to thank you for showing me that I could help someone too." You helped me find my voice by letting me see that you needed it." Matthews was deeply moved by the young prince's words and perspective. "Your Highness, you gave me more than I gave you. You showed me what real courage looks like, and you helped me understand my true purpose. I'll carry that lesson with me in everything I do going forward." Their second meeting was briefer than their first encounter, but equally meaningful. Both of them had been changed by their connection, each discovering strengths and purposes they hadn't known they possessed. George had learned that his voice was most powerful when used to support others, while Matthews had realized that his greatest service lay in providing support to those facing personal crises. As Matthews prepared to leave Windsor Castle for the final time as a member of the Guard, he reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had begun with a young prince's silent recognition of his struggle, Prince George's willingness to step forward, to communicate without words, and finally to speak when it truly mattered, had not only provided Matthews with crucial support during a difficult time, but had also set both of them on new paths of service and purpose. The Guard, who resigned moments after a young prince found his voice, had discovered his own calling in the process, proving that sometimes the most significant moments of change come from the simplest acts of human recognition and connection.